Thank you so much for that introduction. And humor indeed is the solution to all problems at the end of the day. So thank you for that. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my good friend from the United Nations, dear colleagues. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of this important conference for inviting the United Nations as a whole. And of course, we just heard from my distinguished friend and Special Coordinator Tor Wolfson. And it is indeed my distinct honor also to yet again this annual September gathering in person after 3 years. And for me, it's the 5th time in delivering this address to my friends here in Israel and at the ICT in particular. I'd like to express my sincere thanks in particular to my dear friend, Professor Boaz Ganor, founder and executive director of the International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, ICT, as well as Professor Rafi Melnik, president of the Rachman University in Israel here, for hosting this ICT 21st Summit on Counter-Terrorism. And my deepest appreciation, of course, to the government of Israel for its warm hospitality to me and my delegation. I'd like to also acknowledge other distinguished speakers for their excellent contribution to this important conference. And again, I give credit the ICT for bringing such a diverse and such an interesting cast of very distinguished speakers from whom I personally and my team learn. In particular, the Honorable Ayelet Shaked, Minister of Interior of Israel, the Honorable Gideon Sa'ar, Minister of Justice of Israel, the Honorable Ram Ben Barak, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee and member of the Knesset, and of course the head of Mossad, the head of Shin Bet, and head of the military intelligence, so many others. So it's very, very impressive indeed. I have also the honor to extend to you the warm greetings from United Nations headquarters of His Excellency the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and Under Secretary General of the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, from whom you heard yesterday. As my distinguished colleague, the Special Coordinator, Mr. Tor Wansland, who has just spoken, has rightly reminded us, we are here to discuss one of the most challenging issues of our time, combating the global threat posed by terrorism and violent extremism, but looking at it also in the very local context that we just heard from. At the United Nations, we firmly believe in the power of multilateralism as the most effective tool to address the challenge. And I'm proud to note the critical role that the United Nations system as a whole has played in this struggle for many decades and continues to play in the face of the evolving threat of terrorism and violent extremism across the world. The ICT's World Summit on Counterterrorism, which brings together senior officials and leading counterterrorism experts from around the world, is also an excellent example of multilateralism in action. This year, we mark the 5th anniversary of the establishment of our United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and celebrate, if I can call it that, the 16th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy. And I should like to mention that despite the fact that there is no agreed definition of terrorism at the United Nations amongst member states, we have still succeeded in having a consensus resolution and a mandate for the United Nations to take action, supported by all member states, strongly supported, including by the State of Israel. 2 days ago, Your Excellencies, we solemnly commemorated here in Herzliya at the ICT the thousands of victims who perished as a result of the heinous terrorist attacks that occurred in the United States 21 years ago on September 11th, 2001. That was not just an attack on the United States, but an attack on all of the world, including on my own country, in Pakistan, and I myself lost a cousin at the World Trade Center. So this is deeply personal to all of us. In acknowledgement of their suffering and in tribute to the victims of terrorism in so many countries around the world, the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism just last week, hosted a United Nations Global Congress of Victims of Terrorism. And I'm delighted to see my dear colleague David Sharia sitting in front of me, because we collaborated closely with the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate and all relevant United Nations agencies in bringing together the victims of terrorism, the forgotten faces, the forgotten human face of terrorism, together for the first time to garner and mobilize support for them from all relevant sources. The Congress was the largest event of its kind. It was attended by 108 victims from 32 countries and more than 700 participants from over 100 member states, including government ministers and senior officials. But it was not just a typical intergovernmental meeting. It was about victims, for victims, and with victims of terrorism. This discussions gave a voice to victims, not only gave a voice to victims of terrorism, but helped reflect on what the international community must do to help them. And we know that Israel itself has had many victims of terrorism for whom we mourn. I would also like to thank the Natal Israel Trauma and Resilience Center for hosting a successful side event on the margins of our Victims Congress last week, which was entitled, quote, "The Story of Israeli Resilience, How Israeli Society Learned to Cope with Terrorism and Stay Strong." I think that summarizes very much what we've been hearing over the past few days, Professor Gano. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen, as conflicts have grown in intensity over the past decade, terrorist attacks have continued to spread. The impact of terrorism in destroying societies and destabilizing entire regions is clearly visible. I'd like to address the major global terrorism trends in some, and how we can move forward in addressing these imminent and ongoing terrorist threats around the world with a renewed focus on multilateralism. Globally, the threat of terrorism remains high in conflict zones, especially in Africa and the Middle East, where terrorist groups have continued to benefit from instability. In its most recent report, the United Nations Security Council Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team has presented a clear picture of terrorist operations in key regions, where terrorists continue to recruit, raise funds, and plan their attacks. Sub-Saharan Africa in particular accounted for 48% of deaths attributable to terrorist groups globally last year. And terrorist groups and their affiliates are continuing to grow in the Sahel and make inroads into Central and Southern Africa. Terrorists are increasingly exploiting power vacuums, long-standing inter-ethnic strife, internal weaknesses, and state fragilities. In conflict-affected countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, Libya, Mozambique, Somalia, Mali, many other countries, terrorism has intensified cycles of violence, fueling further instability, undermining peace efforts, and setting back development goals. In Iraq and Syria, despite leadership losses, the terrorism threat persists. The repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters, thousands of foreign terrorist fighters from over 100 countries and their families from conflict zones remains a human rights and humanitarian challenge, as well as a security challenge with significant implications. We must address this challenge in line with our international legal and human rights commitments. At the same time, terrorists now exploit new tools and technologies to plan and perpetrate their attacks. The terrorist use of artificial intelligence, cyberspace, and autonomous and remotely operated systems presents major challenges for the prevention of terrorism. Terrorists and violent extremists around the world have adopted have adapted to the digital paradigm of the 21st century using information and communications technology, and in particular online spaces, and the multitude of interactive applications and social media platforms to further their objectives. That is to spread hateful ideology, propaganda, recruit new members, organize financial support and operational tactics, and manage supportive online communities. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, good friends, increasingly terrorist groups look to the use of unmanned aerial systems for reconnaissance attack and conveyance, and seek to develop capabilities to counter their use by law enforcement agencies. At least 188 terrorism-related incidents involving the use of unmanned aircraft systems have been reported or recorded since 2016, with at least 15 taking place just recently between January and September of this year. Additionally, the risk of terrorists gaining access to nuclear and radiological materials poses a significant and growing threat to humanity and international peace and security. In June 2022, for example, Tajikistan reported to the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, that during a special operation, 133 pieces of nuclear material weighing 607 grams were seized from several of its citizens who had planned to sell the materials either within the country or across the border in Afghanistan, which today is controlled by the Taliban. This demonstrates that the prospect of such materials falling into the hands of non-state actors, including terrorists, is all too real. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, terrorist attacks on the basis of xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief, what we call XRIRB, are becoming a major concern for many member states. Indeed, in some member states, this phenomenon now represents the most serious threat to national security, necessitating increasing attention from law enforcement, intelligence, and counterterrorism agencies. Terrorist organizations motivated by xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief, utilize social media, where the crowdsource hateful message and are disseminated, and propaganda is also propagated at vast scales. As the world has grown closer in cyberspace, these terrorist organizations have also been able to more conventionally and conveniently spread their ideology and doctrines across borders with little detection. Recognizing the importance of this issue, the United Nations General Assembly, in its most recent review of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, adopted in June 2021, called upon member states to take appropriate measures to address these new and emerging threats posed by the rise in terrorist attacks on the basis of xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief, to develop a greater understanding of the phenomenon and help build effective measures to counter it. Our United Nations Office of Counterterrorism led the preparation of the report of the United Nations Secretary General on this particular issue, which has just been recently issued last month. And I encourage all of you to please take a look at it. The report provides an overview of the threat as well as challenges and responses to addresses. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, terrorism cannot be countered by any single country alone, no matter how powerful it may be. Enhanced international cooperation and global solidarity is the only way to address transnational, global, regional, and national terrorist threats. The core of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, which was adopted in 2006, has always been focused on strengthening multilateral cooperation. The United Nations Secretary General undertook a major reform of the United Nations counterterrorism architecture by establishing our Office of Counterterrorism in 2017 and subsequently launching the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, which brings together 45 United Nations and non-United Nations entities. Over the past 5 years, our United Nations Office of Counterterrorism has spearheaded global attention and efforts to consolidate and strengthen multilateral efforts to address the rising challenge of transnational terrorism, and has carried out this mission to its fullest capability at the global, regional, and national levels. To this end, the UN Office of Counterterrorism has substantially increased its partnerships with the regional and sub-regional organizations around the world, which has provided an essential link and force multiplier in the multilateral response to terrorism. The partnership of the UN Office of Counterterrorism and United Nations entities with these organizations has proven critical in engaging member states and providing them with tailored and substantive capacity building support. Through these partnerships, we have supported relevant regional organizations to develop regional counterterrorism strategies in Central Africa, Southern Africa, the Arab region, the Caribbean region, and Central Asia. I personally have led the effort, working with the Arab Interior Ministers' Council in developing the Arab Regional Counterterrorism Strategy. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at a time when the international system is increasingly challenged and polarized, it is encouraging to note that counterterrorism still enjoys consensus in all forums of the United Nations, because terrorism still poses threats to the security of all member states. On the occasion, the UN Office of Counterterrorism will be convening the Counterterrorism Week at the United Nations, which brings together the heads of national counterterrorism agencies from around the world to strengthen cooperation addressing priority areas set forth in the relevant United Nations General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. In addition, since its founding, the UNOCT has convened international and regional counterterrorism conferences around the world to foster multilateral counterterrorism cooperation. For example, next month, we will be convening an international conference on border security and management cooperation in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, that will help address security challenges in Central Asia. And next year, we will convene the African Summit on Counterterrorism in Abuja, Nigeria, to strengthen multilateral cooperation in one of the most threatened regions of the world. By way of conclusion, dear friends, distinguished excellencies, we need to underline that stronger cooperation is required, not only between member states, international, regional, and sub-regional organizations, but also with other important stakeholders, including civil society organizations, local communities, academics, research organizations, and the private sector. From this perspective, this annual ICT World Summit on Counterterrorism plays an essential role in strengthening multilateral cooperation in counterterrorism by bringing together leading counterterrorism officials and experts from around the world to share their best practices and experiences. As the saying goes, terrorism only needs to succeed once, and we need to succeed all the time. This requires continued vigilance, resolve, and even more effective collaboration between us, and let us therefore dedicate ourselves to the spirit of Herzliya to mobilize multilateralism and work together in solidarity. I wish you all success. Thank you very much.